Hi everybody, Mr. Chris here. On the morning of November 9th, 1979, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, called NORAD for short, detected over 2,000 communist Russian nuclear missiles heading right for the US of A. Immediately, technicians at NORAD flew into action. They notified the right people. President Carter's plane began preparing to whisk the president into the air and out of harm's reach. And of course, the US prepared to fire back with its own massive nuclear arsenal. At this point, the free market, democratic United States and the communist USSR had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire world 7 times over. The world was about to end. As the US military flew into action, the technicians at NORAD double-checked their data for any mistakes. They quickly noticed that something just wasn't quite adding up. Once again, they notified the right people, the president's plane powered back down, the nuclear missiles stayed in their silos, and after a deeper investigation, NORAD discovered that one of their technicians had mistakenly loaded a training program that simulated Russians attacking the United States. This mistake very nearly killed millions of people and changed the course of history. Believe it or not, a lot of incidents like this one took place during the Cold War. Both the United States and the USSR had nervous fingers on hair triggers. And time after time, an error here or a miscommunication there very nearly unleashed nuclear disaster. We are here today thanks to the quick thinking and level-headedness of many people during the Cold War, people both from the United States and from the USSR. Various types of command economies fall along a continuum of increasing government control. The most extreme type of command economy is communism. Karl Marx wrote several influential books that reinterpreted global economic history, that traced a path toward a communist revolution of the world's societies, and that envisioned the ideal communist utopia. In our class session today, we'll briefly look at various types of command economies. After that, we'll examine communism, starting with Karl Marx, then his books, then his ideas. Finally, we'll end up with his vision for a communist utopia and his plan for achieving that utopia. Let's get started. In command economies, a strong central government directs the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. However, many different types of command economies exist. These different types of command economies each fall somewhere along a continuum of increasing government control. First, nations with hybrid systems of democracy and socialism are the first type of command economy. These are the most free command economies. Many countries of Western Europe have adopted this type of economic and government system. In these countries, taxes are high. The taxes are used to fund government spending on welfare programs, education programs, and other programs for the public good. Also, these countries exhibit a great degree of regulation and control on industries. So if you were to live in one of these countries, you could probably still feel at home. It would be somewhat similar to living in the United States. However, you probably feel fairly pinched. Nations with strong central governments that highly regulate their economies are the second type of command economy. Countries such as this one can be distinguished from the democracy-socialism hybrid nations just down the continuum by the fact that these countries are less democratic, meaning the governments in these countries are controlled by a small number of people or perhaps dominated by a central figure like a dictator. Countries such as this one can also be distinguished from the communist countries on up the continuum by their allowance of private ownership of property. Instead of having the government own everything like communist countries, these governments allow private citizens to own things and elect instead to highly regulate every aspect of the economy. Probably the best example of this kind of economic system is Hitler's Nazi Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. For about 10 years during that time period, Hitler stood as a strong central figure that dominated German politics. While Hitler tightly controlled the economy, he did not try to create a communist government or a communist economic system. In fact, fascists such as Hitler hated communists and fought them tooth and nail. One of the reasons for that was that communism was mostly the brainchild of a man named Karl Marx that we'll learn about in just a bit. And Marx was a Jew. As you know, Hitler did not like Jews. Nations with communist governments are the third type of command economy. Communist countries exhibit the most extreme degree of government control over all aspects of life, including their economies. Next, we'll discuss communism in greater detail. The communist story begins with a man named Karl Marx that I just mentioned. He was born in 1818 to rich Jewish parents in Prussia, a country that has since been rolled into the modern country of Germany. Throughout his lifetime, Marx assembled and developed the ideas undergirding communism. He wrote several highly influential books. The first of these was called the Communist Manifesto. Here are the first words of the book. "A specter haunts Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance in order to lay this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police." End quote. Within months of its publication, the working classes of Europe had risen up violently against their governments. Guns, cannons, blood, all in the streets. But Marx's book had very little to do with all of that. Marx also wrote a book called Das Kapital, which he published in 1867. While the Communist Manifesto developed his communist theories, Das Kapital focused on the problems with capitalism. During his lifetime, Marx left nearly no mark on society. He died a very poor man. Almost no one attended his funeral. By his death in 1883, his ideas were nearly forgotten. But 100 years later, in 1983, roughly a third of the world's population lived in countries shaped by Marx's ideas. So, what were those ideas? Karl Marx reinterpreted global history through an economic lens. He believed that two groups of people have existed for all of human history: those who own property and those who do the work. Marx called the property owners the bourgeois. He called the workers the proletariat. Marx believed that the narrative of human history is driven by a constant struggle between these two groups. While the property-owning bourgeois cling to power, the hard-working proletariat are constantly fighting for more freedom and more rights. Marx believed that the economic relationship between owners and workers started with a master-slave relationship. In this case, the master owned everything, the slave owned nothing. This was the most unfair and least equal arrangement of the different scenarios. Marx believed that medieval feudalism was an improvement over slavery. In this case, property owners like kings, dukes, barons, and knights owned tracts of land that serfs were forced to work. However, the serfs did get to keep their own gardens, some of their own fields, and their own houses. This arrangement was more fair and more equal than slavery, but still far from ideal. Marx believed that modern capitalism was the next step of improvement over feudalism. In this case, businessmen got to own the factors of production, the workers got paid wages. This arrangement was more fair and more equal still than feudalism, but also far from the communist ideal. Marx envisioned an ideal communist society in which class and economic differences among people did not exist. In his communist utopia, Marx envisioned a world in which everyone lived in small, rural communities. Cities would cease to exist. People would farm and make their own goods. Everyone would own everything together. No one would be rich or poor. People wouldn't fight with each other. Why would they? All strife and struggle, which were caused by the constant struggle between the owners and the workers, would now be gone. When everyone was both an equal owner and a worker, there's nothing to fight about. Life would be perfect in this communist utopia. Marx laid out a plan for fomenting a communist revolution. He believed that when the time was right, a violent group of communists would need to seize control of their country through a bloody coup. After purging all the people in the country who would simply stand in the way, the revolutionaries would seize all the private property in the country. They would then tightly control this property and the economy. They would determine who needed what goods and services. They would organize government-run factories, farms, and shops to produce these goods and services. Everyone would have enough, but not too much. As the people in the country grew accustomed to communist values, the government would loosen up its tight grip. It would organize people into the communes, then it would slowly fade away as the people began to take care of themselves with no need for government. By the early 1900s, Marx's forgotten ideas began to look very attractive, and they were rediscovered. The sooty, grimy, impoverished reality of the capitalism-driven industrial revolution led many people to believe humans were capable of much more and living much better lives. Around the turn of the century, Westerners dreamed of a perfect world free of crime, free of poverty, free of war. An idealistic world much better than the world they knew seemed just out of reach. Now the time was right for Marx's communist ideas. Now, it's hard to imagine this looking back on the horrors of communism in the 1900s, but many people, even those living in Western Europe and the United States, were communists. In fact, if you were a teenager living in the early 1900s, there's a really good chance you would have been a communist. Communism promised a world free from the problems of earlier generations. No one could foresee the decades of violence, terror, and poverty that communism was about to unleash. Okay, let's summarize. First, we looked at various types of command economies. We placed them on a continuum of increasing government control. The least controlled command economies are those seen in countries that mix democracy with aspects of socialism. The second type of command economy is the type that is controlled by a strong central government that still allows private property ownership. The third and most extreme type of command economy is communism. Second, we examined the basics of communism. We learned about Karl Marx. We discussed the two influential books he wrote and published, The Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. We then turned to examine Marx's interpretation of human history through the lens of the constant struggle between the property-owning bourgeois and the working proletariat. We looked at Marx's vision for an ideal society, and finally, we took a look at Marx's plan to bring about his communist vision. I hope you have an excellent rest of your day. Mr. Chris, out.